Alrighty, I hope everyone is having a good evening. We've had a long day today, a good informal long day. Starting at 11, we had our first show, but we're joined this evening for a very, very special guest. And we're actually have a guest from Thailand, Mr. Roger Youngblood, retired major from the Air Force and a Skyraider pilot, among other things. And he is going to speak to us tonight, covering his career in the Air Force, or at least what we can fit in part one. We're going to have several parts of this, so don't worry if you guys don't catch this live and are watching it on the replay. He will be back, so do not worry about that. But I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Roger, let him kind of introduce himself, and we'll just go from there. So, Mr. Roger, the floor is yours, sir.
Hey, good morning from Thailand. I hope everyone is well. I want to thank you, Bob, for this interview, and I'm glad that some of this information is getting out, and I'm certainly glad that it's a Q&A type of a video where if someone has a question, I can try to answer it. I'm not sure that I have the total answer, but I'll give it a shot. I just wanted to give a little bit of background of how I got into the Air Force. I had what I consider to be a very unusual career. It didn't follow the path of most guys that got in and went up the ranks, but I certainly enjoyed it. I retired after 24 years. The big point in my career was 9 of those years were spent in Thailand, off and on, back and forth. And so when I finally retired in Texas and decided I needed to move somewhere where I could make living a little bit easier now that I'm 80 years old, I said, well, I love Thailand. I speak the language fairly well. I love the people, the culture, the food especially. And so I moved back, and sort of like coming full circle. I started out here in 70 in Vietnam, and I'm back. And so I'm enjoying it. I have recently met Air Chief Marshal Borchat, who's in charge of the Nakhon airfield. And he wants to do a little rebuilding and rework there. So that's another story for another day, but we're going to possibly build a museum there honoring all the U.S. military forces from 65 to 75. So I'll start out by just saying that once I had graduated from college in 68, I was working in Texas, and I am from Taylor, Texas. And a year or so later, I had gotten a draft notice, and I had been drafted into the Army. A lot of the stories, or a lot of the things that I talk about, I equate to the old Yogi Berra saying, you come to the Y in the road and you take it. Well, I had a lot of Y's in the road for myself. And fortunately, the good Lord was looking out after me. And I think I'm happy now, and I made some correct decisions. But I was drafted into the Army, and I knew nothing about the military. Back in the days when I was a young man like that, well, on the second floor of the post office were all the recruiting offices. Excuse me. So I took that letter and I went to the post office, went upstairs, and the Army sergeant said, yes, sir, you've been drafted to be back here in about 25 days. You'll be on a bus going to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and you're going to be in the infantry. So I didn't know that was good or bad, but it was probably bad. The longevity of lieutenants in Vietnam was not that long. And so I went to the next door, and there was the Navy, and then I went to the Marines, and they all said the same thing. Yeah, you're in the Army. But I went to the Air Force, and the recruiter there looked at it, and he said, yeah. He says, all the lieutenants and all the services get paid the same. He said, except if you're a pilot and you're in the Air Force, we'll pay you a little extra. And I said, what? And I didn't understand what the pay scale was, obviously. But he said, yeah. He said, if you qualify to be a pilot, you'll get pilot pay, and that'll be a little more than basic lieutenant pay. And I said, well, how do I do that? Or how do I get out of the Army? And he said, well, you have to fill out these forms and all. And if it works out, he said, I'll try to get you transferred over. It's a 50-50 deal. And I said, all right, well, I just sat down, and he pulled out some paperwork. And a couple of hours later, I handed him back the forms and the things that the tests that he had given me to finish. So I thought that it didn't happen, because I was about 2 days away from having to go back and get on the bus to Fort Polk when my parents got a call from the recruiter, and he said, tell your son that I've got him transferred over to the Air Force and he's out of the Army. So that was the first big Y in the road for me. And boy, was I now, as I look back, was I glad of that. So we went back down there and I talked to him and he said, yeah, you're going to go to Medina Air Force Base and you're going to be in officer training school. And after that, you qualified to be a pilot. That's one reason that I was accepted. And he said, then you're going to probably go to a pilot training base, which was, I wound up going to Reese in Lubbock, Texas. And from there, we'll see what the future holds. But right now, this was the late 68, 69 time frame. We're needing all the pilots we can get to go to Vietnam. And I said, well, okay, I'm for that. So anyway, that was the whole story. And after Medina and 90-day wonder, and I graduated as a second lieutenant, and they sent me to Reese Air Force Base. I was between 37s and 38s. You go from T-41s to T-37s, and I'd finished the T-37 training. And I was walking over to base ops one day, and these two A-1s were taxiing in, and I looked at them. I'd never seen an A-1 in my life, but I loved the sound of that big engine at 3,350 horsepower, or cubic inch, rather, 2,800 horsepower. It sounded like a big Harley Davidson motorcycle. And I loved the sound of that thing as it loped along at 1,000 RPM. And so the base ops guy said, yeah, those are two A-1 guys that are in training at Hurlburt, and they are on cross country and all, and they'll be in here in a minute, and you can talk to them. So they came in, and I did. And they explained to me what they were doing, and the student was with his instructor pilot, IP. And so I decided right then, I said, well, if I'm going to go to Vietnam, I said, I sure would like to fly one of those. And it all depended on where you graduated in the class and actually what came down. I think there was 6 UPT bases all over the states at that time, mostly in Texas. Well, out of 68 people, I graduated, I think, number 12 or 13. And we had a bad batch of aircraft come down, mostly trash haulers, B-52s, C-141s, C-123s and all. There were 2 F-4s, but they were backseat F-4s. And then there was 1 A-1. So the first 2 or 3, 4 guys scarfed up the F-4s and the A-1, so I was left to do what I could do. And just a brief note, at that time, our student squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Howie Pearson, had come back from his tour in Vietnam, and he had flown the C-123K model. So he told me, he said, if you'll go over there and take this 123, he said, you'll fly about 5 or 6 sorties a day. He said, your proficiency will go through the roof. And he said, as soon as you get there, he says, under this current administration, if you volunteer for a concurrent overseas tour, you can pick the aircraft of your choice. And I said, well, that means I could pick that A-1. He said, that's right. So I decided to do that. So I went off to Hurlburt and got my 123 training out of the way. And by the way, at that time, the A-1 training was going on at Hurlburt. So I visited with those folks a lot. And then when I went over to Thompson Nude Air Force Base in Saigon, I checked in and got squared away. And about a week or so later, I went down to the personnel center office and recruitment and records. And I looked for the guy about assignments, and I talked to him. It was a tech sergeant. And I said, I'm here. I want to volunteer for a second tour, and I want to pick an aircraft. And he looked at me and he said, how long you been in country? I said, about a week, 2 weeks. He said, man, you haven't been here long enough to know if you want to continue in this war. And I said, no. I said, I want to fly the A-1 SKYRAIDER. And I understand if I come back, I can get the aircraft of my choice. And he said, yeah, that's right. I said, all right. So he shook his head and got the paperwork out, and I filled it out and signed it. And I had 3 choices. I put the A-1 SKYRAIDER in all 3 choices. So he fired that thing off, and I guess it was about a month later, I was at the squadron flying sorties, and I got a call from the ops officer, and he said, you need to go over to the personnel office. They want to talk to you. And I said, all right. So I went over there, and he said, well, you've got your assignment. He said, you're going to A-1s at NKP. He said, once you leave here, you will go back to Hurlburt and get your training out of the way, and then you'll be coming back to Thailand and flying A-1s. He said, I sure hope that's what you want to do. I said, it's exactly what I want to do. The lucky thing for me was there was a squadron of A-1s, VNAV, Vietnamese Air Force A-1s at Tan Son Nhut, just across the taxiway from where our 123s were. So I spent a lot of time over there in the next 8 months visiting with those guys. Some could speak English, some couldn't, but they let me sit in the cockpit. They didn't care. But the good part about that was the same engine in the A-1 was in the 123. So I didn't have a lot of learning curve to go through, but I got out of the 123 there in Tan Son Nhut and went back to Hurlburt, and I checked out and got sent back to NKP. And I just loved my tour at NKP. At that time, things were being drawn down in Vietnam, and they had originally 3 squadrons at NKP. And as you can see in that photo, this base was cut right out of the jungle. They came in there in early '64 and started cutting away at it. And we're on the northeast corner of Thailand, strategically located so you could get out into Laos and Vietnam easy to maintain the war. But there wasn't much there except us. And it was kind of unique that it was only a propeller-driven base. There was A-1s, AC-119, C-47s, U-21s, HH-53s, a lot of props, but no jets. So it was a 56 special special squadron, a special wing, operations wing, and General Heine Adderholt, or Colonel at that time, had set up that base and was working it. And it originally started out with PSP runway, and then they eventually upgraded to concrete or asphalt and went from there. But I enjoyed that tour. When I got there, like I said, the other 2 squadrons, the Zorros and the Fireflies, had condensed down into the Hobo Squadron. And the picture you see there is pre-revetment. We built revetments around the A-1s, and they were in existence when I got there. But anyway, we had a great squadron, but it was full because there's so many people. If you hadn't been there over 6 months, you got put into the first SOS, or the Hobos. And if you had over 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, they could curtail your tour and you could go back or get another assignment. I think that's the way it worked out. Anyway, I had a great time there. The mission that I loved the most, obviously, was close air support, because you got to help out the good guys and take care of the bad guys. But the Hobos also had the mission of search and rescue, or SAR. And the call sign was Sandy. And, you know, when somebody got shot down or bailed out or whatever, I have to hand it to the people that ran the war on the military side in Vietnam, because the war pretty much came to a halt as far as air power goes. And if the SAR folks, Sandys, the A-1 guys, needed aircraft, all they had to do was say, I need F-4s, I need 105s, I need whatever. And you could get it, because the primary reason that we were launched was to rescue those guys, the good guys, and our own allies had some SARs also. But the thing was that once we found out somebody was down, we could respond quickly. We transitioned over time into airborne SAR alert, and 2 A-1s would fly in the morning over the Steel Tiger in Laos and just drone and cut holes in the sky and all until we had about 5 hours of fuel on board. So we could hang up there for a while until our SAR airborne commitment was over. And then they turned us over to the FAC in Laos, and we got to put in our ordnance, and we did get to strike. Then we'd come down, and then the afternoon guys would be airborne. But the good part of that is we were airborne. So if something happened, we could go directly to the scene. And the key to getting a guy out of the jungle was to get there as quick as possible before the bad guys encircled him and tried to capture him or whatever. But they had their tricks, and, you know, they had no D-Ros. Those boys there were in there 3, 4, 5, 6 years. They were proven combat veterans, the Pathet Lao and the Viet Cong and the NVA and all. And so they knew one thing, that if we were determined to go pick someone up if somebody got shot down. So sometimes they finally learned. They said, we're just going to sit and wait. We're not going to capture this guy. We're not going to do anything. We can get him anytime we want to, if they knew where he was. So they'd come within a close range and try to encircle him and all and wait. And their proven moment, the moment they were waiting for was when we would bring that Jolly Green in to pick him up. And that Jolly Green went into a hover at 100 foot. And then July the 4th broke loose. I mean, it was unbelievable. So we learned too, as we were there, and we would talk with the down pilot if we could and see if he had any recollection or knew of any bad guys in the area and all. And we would sanitize the area as best we could if we thought there were. If it was an uncontested pickup, we could move quickly to get him. And we were pretty successful. There was a lot of guys that paid with their lives to rescue people in Thailand, SARS, and some good A-1 guys did what they thought was best, and they paid the ultimate price. But obviously, hats off to those, and they will never be forgotten. So after I was in there nearly a year, I'd been notified that JustMag, General Adderholt, was looking for, or JustMag in period, was looking for advisors for their T-28 squadron. What you did was you would come and you would work out of JustMag in Bangkok, but you were either at Ubon, Udorn, Tok Lee, some of the places where the Thais had T-28 squadrons, and the Thais really wanted advisors from the U.S. Air Force to come and work one guy in each squadron. So I was looking at the assignments coming down out of NPC, and they just weren't good. You know, there's so many pilots going back to the States. It was just a glutton of you go to ATC if you got lucky. If you didn't, you went to rated supplement, like you took over a maintenance squadron or something like that, or you went back possibly to crash orders, 141s or something. So I didn't want any of that. I was still excited about the war. I was excited about what I'd been doing, and going back and sitting at a desk or sitting in the right seat of a 141, that didn't strike my fancy. So I talked to JustMag. I said, what do I need to do to apply for this? And he said, well, come down to see us, and we'll see what we can do with the paperwork. And at that time, we had what we called the Klong Bird. It went around as a 130 that made a circuit all around the bases in Thailand. So I jumped on that one day when I had a day or two off and went to JustMag, talked to them, signed up with them, and they said that they would contact NPC and my assignment would be forthcoming. Well, it wasn't long, and I got a notice that I was assigned back into JustMag at MACV. In between leaving NKP and going back to Thailand to be a T-28 advisor is what I thought. They sent me to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, which is another hardship tour for a year in California and Monterey and Cannery Row. But I got in there, and it was kind of funny. I met, there was an Air Force, Army, Navy, anybody that was going back to Thailand had to go through language school if you were going to be in the State Department or you were going to be an advisor. And so there was about 20 of us in the class. And I remember the department head, Kuntora, came in the first day and met all of us. And she introduced herself and told us about the school and all. And just as we were getting ready to leave and come back the next day to start school, she said, oh, by the way, this is the last day you'll ever hear us speak English here. And that was it. And the next morning we came back, and it was Sawadee Krap and all that. And we never heard another word of English for a year. And it's just their immersion of you into the language. And it was great. And it was the way that they train people. And I enjoyed that year at Monterey with those Thai teachers. They were all Thai nationals. And I had what I called my language bucket list. I had a few things I could say and couldn't, but I learned a lot. And it was difficult, I thought, for a guy from Texas to go in there and say Sawadee howdy. And they didn't catch that too much. But anyway, I said, I don't know with my slang and my Texas talk if y'all can teach me Thai or not. But it worked out well, and I was appreciative for what they did. So I got back into Thailand, and I walked into General Adderholt's office and said, well, I'm back, and I'm glad to be here, and what T-28 squadron do you want me to go to, and et cetera, et cetera. Oh, by the way, after language school, I went back to Hurlburt, got checked out in the T-28, and then on into Thailand. And he looked at me and he said, well, not so fast, Youngblood. He said, he slid a 8x10 black and white photo around. He says, you know what that is? And I said, no, I don't. He said, well, that's a AU-23 Stoll Porter. He said, there was a big experiment going on at Eglin Air Force Base. It was a fly-off competition between Fairchild AU-23 and the Helio Stallion AU-24. And under tax brilliance, they decided not to pursue putting 1,000 of those airplanes in the war. So, excuse me. So he said, we're gonna get 13 of them, and they're going up to Kokatiem. And he said, I want you to be the advisor there for them. He said, I got an MTT, that's a military training team, coming over that were the IPs in the AU-23 at Eglin, and they'll be training you and checking you out. And from there, you're going to build a squadron. And so that was quite not a shock, but I'd never flown a Porter or a turboprop. So I'd had jets and I'd had recips, but that was it. So anyway, I said, okay, yes, sir. Saluted smartly and was on my way out to Kokatiem and got settled in up there. And I met the commander and all, and he was glad to see me. And so there is your picture of the Porter there on the right. It's a powerful airplane. I think it was 750 shaft horsepower in that engine. And they had put a gun in the left side of the airplane, an XM-197 Gatling gun. It's a 3-barrel, 20 millimeter. And they had put some 3 rocket pods under each wing. So it was fairly well armed for like FAC and recce and all that. And that was mainly what they were going to do, is patrol the river and all, and engage if they had to. So we started a training exercise there and building up the squadron. They were drawing from T-28 pilots and other pilots in the Air Force to fill that squadron. So in about a month, we had 25 pilots there, and we started checking people out. And it was a wonderful year. I lived with the Thais there at Kokatiem Air Force Base, and myself and the Fairchild rep there's the gun picture right there. And so the gunner would sit right behind there, and there's how they loaded the gun. The guys would bring the ammunition out and put it in a big can, and then we would fire the gun out. It was 520 rounds, 20 mag in the can. But anyway, back to the story. I trained those guys, and we did well, and they soon took a lot of pride in their airplane and what they could do. It was a very special airplane because it could land and take off in a very short distance, and it was used in the Swiss Alps as a porter to rescue skiers and things like that. And it was it was a good airplane. I enjoyed flying it. So during that time and working for General Adderholt, things started to take a turn as the 73 peace accords, Paris peace accords, went into effect and all. And I was up at Kokatiem, and General Adderholt knew at that time that we had turned over, or were turning over, a lot of airplanes as we exited out of Vietnam and out of Thailand and so forth. So in the transition, we turned over aircraft that we were not going to bring back to the U.S., and it turned over to the Vietnamese Air Force. And at the time, they were fairly small and didn't have a lot. But just as a note, once the turnover was finished, the Vietnamese Air Force had 2,276 aircraft. They had all of a sudden grown to be the 4th largest Air Force in the world. They had 40 F-5s, many of them brand new right off the showroom floor. They had 78 A-37s, and they had A-1s that they had already had, but they got the rest of the A-1s out of NKP. And then they had other things. They had some AC-119 gunships, Buku C-47s and C-7s and O-1s. So they become a large Air Force. And as you can see here, where the DMZ was, that in red is North Vietnam, and the south and yellow is the South Vietnam. And where that airplane is parked right there, that's Nakhon Phanom. That's where we were at NKP. And like I said, we could take off out of there and turn to the east, and we were in the war. And so the yellow or the white arrows was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They decided, the North Vietnamese did, that they had to supply the Viet Cong in the south with arms and munitions and everything else. And so they built this road just inside of Laos. It went all the way down and exited at various points into South Vietnam. And so really cutting that road would have gone a long way into ending the war. And there was a lot of action there on that road, but it wasn't enough. So anyway, I went on training the Thais in the Porter, but I was starting to get some phone calls in 74 from General Adderholt. And he was saying, you know, things are not looking well. And he said, I don't doubt that before long, if the BNAB doesn't get their stuff together and we can really stop the advance of the North Vietnamese, that there's going to be some serious consequences. During this time, we had advisors in Cambodia, and the Cambodians had about a couple of hundred airplanes. Most of we had given them. Then they got the AU-24 also from Helio Stallion after Credible Chase was terminated. But some things that happened in early 75, as I move on, General Adderholt talked to the ambassador in Cambodia, and he said, you know, it's not going well. And he said, the one thing I want to do is save as many people as I can, and I want to get as many aircraft out of Cambodia as I can. The Cambodian, or the U.S. ambassador to Cambodia, was very, very receptive to that. And he decided with Adderholt to come up with a plan how at some point in the near future, which was about March, they were going to try to exit Cambodia and they would come to Utapao. And this is just the first of the movements or escapes from Cambodia and Vietnam into Thailand. And the primary base for all this was Utapao for them to get to. Well, come to find out, there was 97 aircraft that had escaped from Cambodia that went to Utapao. And I have a little map here of, as the war went down and times were coming to a halt, the General Adderholt presented this plan to the ambassador. And he said, the last day that we're going to be flying in combat here, he says, I would like to get our people and our T-28s and their families out of here. And General Adderholt came up with a plan, and he said, I want you to take off out of Phnom Penh. And he says, I want you to go from Phnom Penh up to the Khmer Rouge. And he said, you can bomb all you want to right there. Well, 2 days before this happened, he told the commander there of the Khmer Air Force, he said, put all the pilots' families and everything on buses. And he said, send them over to Bottom Bomb. And he said, now, after they bomb over here, the Khmer area, he said, they're going to RTB into Bottom Bomb and they're going to load bombs again. And they did. The only thing was, as they rearmed, they put their families in the back seat. And they took off out of there with Mark 82s, guns, and their families. And they went back to the Khmer Rouge area and they bombed again. And then this time they came on out. And when they RTB'd, they came to Utapao. And that's part of the 97 aircraft that was saved. And I hand my hats off again to General Adderholt. You're going to hear me say that 1,000 times in this briefing, because I'm telling you, he was a warrior that like they're none other. And I just, I loved him as a person. There's his picture and all. And I'll just show you one thing that I would love for everybody to buy. This is the book, Air Commando 1, which is the whole life story of General Adderholt. He was a warrior of supreme level. I mean, he knew close air support from World War II to Korea mainly, and flying everything that could be flown. He got involved with the agency to do a lot of good work in Laos and all, and he brought a lot of Hmong refugees out of Laos, and they wouldn't have got out if it wouldn't have been for him. So I was just, the more I worked around him, was the better it was. And just a side note, as many of you have seen the movie Star Wars, and that section of the movie where there's a bar and there's all kind of looking like animals in their bar, and they're different species and everything, and they all got their own warships and all, that they're doing their thing. Well, I want to tell you a little story about the Chapia Hotel in Bangkok. That was a military hotel for U.S. personnel that went and come that, and out to the States and come into Thailand and all. Well, General Adderholt had a room up there that he stayed in some of the time. And so I got a call and said, meet me at the Chapia Hotel. I want to talk to you about whatever. Anyway, he stayed in close contact with me. So I got down to the Chapia and I walked into the bar. It was about 6 o'clock or so. And he had a special place in that bar where he sat down at the end of the bar and he drank his gin and tonics and he carried on business. When he left his office at Just Mag, he went down to the Chapia Hotel in the bar, and everybody that was anybody came through the Chapia, going or coming, and he was meeting people and doing business. And there was a chair next to him at the bar, and I soon learned that when he looked at you and nodded, that was your cue to come over and have a seat. So I did, and he talked about this and that and telling me what he had plans for. And this was before the Cambodian fall. And he said, you flew the A-1. And he said, and Jack Drummond flew the A-1. He was a major working for General Adderholt out of Don Muang at the time. And he said, you're the two guys in Just Mag that flew A-1s. And he said, if these A-1s ever escape out of Vietnam to Utapao, he says, I want to get as many of them as I can and actually hide them, steal them from the North Vietnamese. And he didn't know exactly how all that was going to come about at that time, but I was notified that, hey, the day may come when you may be called on to help us out. And I said, yes, sir. So anyway, it was just a funny thing how he carried on business. And there was F4 guys in that bar. There was 105 guys, C-141s. That's why it looked like the Star Wars bar. And there was a coat of many colors in there. So anyway, he was a fantastic individual and just straight business all the time. But he had the Warriors' best interest at heart, and he had America's best interest at heart. And he loved the Allies, the Thailand. And there's his picture on the right. And I think he's sitting there with that leader, Vang Pao, General Vang Pao from Laos. And that's another. Yeah, that's another war hero of Laos. And he and Vang Pao worked together to get a lot of the Hmong fighters out of there. They had thousands of them that had come from the villages to be trained how to fight and try to keep Laos a free country. But it was a losing battle, but he did get a lot of them out. But anyway, as things started to fall apart in early 75, I had received a phone call, and he told me, he says, all right, things are not well. And he said, by the way, you're going to get a friend is going to bring over a couple of Cambodian pilots in their AU-24. And he says, I've greased the skids with the Thai Air Force that you can train them to shoot that gun. He said, they need some training. And I said, okay. So there's the AU-24. It looks just like the 23. XM gun is out the side. And so one day this airplane lands, and the base commander at Kokatiem calls me, and he says, hey, I got an airplane out here that I need you to go check out. He says, I don't understand really what's going on. He said, I think I do. I said, yes, sir, I'll go check it out. So I got over to the airplane, and these Cambodian pilots came out, and they had a guy in a safari suit from the agency. He was with them. And he said, hey, he says, we've coordinated this with General Adderholt, and I need you to train these guys into shooting the gun at Shandy Range there, just not very far from Kokatiem. And what they do, they'd get into 30 degrees of bank, and they'd circle the target and all at a couple of thousand feet. And the gunner would try to learn how to fire the gun and lead and all this and that. And so they weren't very skilled at that time. And the pilots weren't very skilled at flying, tell you the truth. But we were going to try to help them. So I spent a week training the Cambodian pilots, and the gunner got to practice shooting at the target at Shandy Range. And kind of the way it worked was they didn't speak English, of course, and they were fluent in Cambodian, and they spoke a lot of French. So I got the agency guy to sit there, pull a chair up between us, and I said, let me tell you something. He flew with me on every mission. I said, when I tell this guy that I got the airplane, if he puts it into a situation where I need to take over control, I said, you better tell him quickly to get his hands off the stick, and I'm flying the airplane. Or I'll, he'll get a knock upside the head or something. I'm going to take over the airplane. He said, yeah, I got that. So I'd speak to him in English and he'd speak to the Cambodian guy in French, and away we went. So we trained them for about a week, and they were happy with the training. They learned a lot. I tried to teach them a little bit about flying the airplane itself, and they returned to Cambodia. I don't know if they escaped with the other 97 airplanes when they got out of Cambodia to Utapao or not, but they were good people. They were fighting for the freedom of their country, and that's something that you just have to remember. So as time went on, in February, we got into March, and Cambodia fell, and the airplanes came. Well, then we were getting fairly close to April, and I got another call from Adderholt, and he said, I want you to go down to Trot in your AU-24 or 23 and look around. He said, that's the closest airfield to Vietnam. It's in the southeast corner of Thailand, right next to Cambodia. It's about 3,000 foot grass strip. He said, there's going to be a lot of airplanes if they start coming out of Vietnam, helicopters and all. It's going to be low on gas, and they're going to need a place to land. And that's exactly what happened. And he was so into it. But he had contacted the ambassador in Vietnam, and he said, look, I think his name was Ambassador Graham. And he said, you know, and I know that things are going south big time. And the NVA is on the march, and they're taking over airfields, and they were moving. And all in all, when they finally got to Saigon and took the place over, they had captured 933 American aircraft, or VNAV aircraft, which weren't much, but mainly American aircraft that had been given to the Vietnamese. So they had a heck of a large air force right there. And the Thai government was scared to death, and the U.S. didn't want them bringing them over to or attacking Thailand, because we'd have to get back in the war big time as an ally. So anyway, he told Graham, he said, the ambassador, he said, look, I have a plan to evacuate most of the Vietnamese Air Force into Utapao, and we can save a lot of people. And Graham just, I don't know how it went, but Adderholt told me he wouldn't hear about it. He said, look, he said, that's a defeatist attitude. It looks like we're giving up and all. And he says, I'm not going to do that. And Adderholt just said, well, he said, I can't do it without your approval. And it wasn't long after that, a few weeks and all, until things went south big time, and the NVA was outside of Saigon. And Graham was on a helicopter out of there trying to escape with the American flag under his arm, and probably thinking back, man, I should have listened to General Adderholt. I could have saved a lot of people's lives. And so there's a magazine that was written up by Colonel Witterhahn. This was a Smithsonian Aerospace magazine. And this is the copy, the front copy of it. It's January of 97. And Colonel Witterhahn did a lot of research into this, and really tells the story of the fall of South Vietnam on the 29th of April. And it's labeled Escape to Utapao. You can Google this and you can see it, but I just want you to take a look at that photo. That's when the bombs and the rockets and all were falling on Tan Son Nhut, and it was just a Wild West show. So the pilots were running out the door, trying to get into anything that had gas that would crank, and they had talked among themselves, and they were going to head to Utapao or try to get somewhere safe. So that began the debacle, as I call it, because Ambassador Graham would not let General Adderholt set up a transition to save all those people and all, but a lot got out. And so, you know, I look back on that, and there was just some mistakes that were made by the civilians. And I don't badmouth anybody, but I know there was a general one time that had told the president, he said, if you'll let the military run the war, he said, it'll be over in 2 weeks. He said, we'll make a parking lot out of North Vietnam. And I believe that to this day. If the military had been able to go forward and do what we were supposed to and not had one hand tied behind our back, I think we could have successfully concluded that war. But that's neither here nor there now. It's history. So as the people started to come out and come into Utapao, they escaped left and right. Some made it, some didn't. A lot of airplanes or helicopters are starting to run out of gas, and General Adderholt had pre-positioned some helicopters and trucks with 55-gallon drums of avgas and all at different points on the east side of Thailand to help out if some helicopter landed in a rice paddy or whatever. And that exactly happened. Some helicopters landed on the beach. They ran out of gas in Cambodia, and they were apprehended by the Cambodian police at the time, but they were subsequently turned over to the Thai military authorities, so they did get out. And trot became very valuable. That grass strip was, it was 30 minutes to 45 minutes to the east of Utapao. So people that were coming in light aircraft, helicopters, O-1s, things like that, could land there if they were low on fuel. And one of the incidences that happened while I was there, and the helicopters were starting to come out in early April, a helicopter landed, and I don't know the exact date, but I was there on the ground, and I had gotten a Vietnamese pilot to fly in the right seat of my porter as we would fly around, and he would broadcast on guard to different folks about where to go and what to do and all in Vietnamese, and just give them some direction. I was trying to help as much as I could, and we were really at the edge of Cambodia, as far east as we could literally go legally, but whatever. So anyway, after I landed back at Trot, and I was there, and a helicopter landed, and I call this the young and the old version. I was there on the ground refueling my 23, and this helicopter landed, and as usual, there was a ton of people in there. You understand the Vietnamese people are small in stature and all, but they can stack some folks into a helicopter and a 130 and a C-47, which we saw, especially back at Utapao. Well, coming out of that helicopter, and I was standing about 50 yards away, and all, I saw this elderly lady. She was about 95, 96. She was in her black ao dai. The ao dai is a dress that the Vietnamese ladies wear in Vietnam. She was a real old lady, that some gray hair pulled back and all, and she was carrying this plastic bag in front of her. And so I saw that, and I saw a young girl get off the airplane, about 17, 18 years old, and she was carrying a child. So I was very interested in that, because you have to think about it. These people all of a sudden got out of bed and said, we got to leave our homeland. We've got to leave our country. We've got to leave our families. And many of them did leave their families behind. It was terrible. But I asked that lieutenant, I said, find out what that lady's got. He went over there and talked to her and all. He came back and he said that clear plastic bag means a lot to her. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, well, it's her goldfish. She had taken her goldfish that she had for years and years in her Vietnamese home, and that was her thing. She didn't have a suitcase. She didn't have a big bag of anything, but she brought her favorite treasured item of a goldfish out in a plastic bag with water, and she was going to get that thing out of Vietnam. So I just shook my head, and it really struck me then what it meant to these people to have to leave everything to come to freedom. So I asked him about that young girl, and come to find out she was 17 years old, and she had a 4-day-old baby in her arms. So here it hit me that this was the youngest thing that was coming to freedom ever. And I would love to know where that 4-day-old baby wound up after 20, 30, 40 years, but whatever. But the elderly lady came and was transported back to Utapao to the refugee camp, and the young girl and her 4-day-old baby was transported back to safety and freedom. And that just meant a lot. I just took a minute to really appreciate America. So anyway, Adderholt said, I want you to go back up to Don Muang and pick up Jack Grumman and fly him down to Utapao. And you guys, these airplanes are coming out of here now. And I just have to say that was a Wild West show. If I could just put it in simpler terms, it wouldn't be any other way. It was just a Wild West show. You have to understand this. SAC still had 20 B-52s at Utapao. They were in control of that base. And all of a sudden, there was the Strategic Air Command there, or U.S. Air Force. there was the Cambodian Air Force, and there was quickly amassing a huge Vietnamese Air Force, and there was the Thai Air Force and Navy. So that base was packed. And this picture you see here is one of the A-1s that Jack Drummond and I stole or repossessed, I guess you could call it. It was U.S. military aircraft. So we repossessed that airplane and flew it up to Tak Lee and turned it over to the Thai commander. I'll get into that story in just a minute. But anyway, back to the base. The airplanes were just, as I was there on the ramp looking at things and all, I saw a C-47 land from the north and had one engine was smoking, and a Caribou C-7 was landing from the south, and they had no contact with the Thai, and even if they did, they couldn't speak English, and there was no controlled effort to land aircraft. Helicopters on the grass, O-1s would land on taxiways and taxi off into the grass. So to put it as a Wild West show would be probably not doing it justice, but it was something else. But it's a wonder that more didn't crash right there and people killed. But, you know, I still go back and I say the Lord was with a lot of those people, and so many of them all survived and got out and finally came to some freedom in Guam and the U.S. But there was a lot of airplanes that came out. I think that the total was 3,900 refugees came out of Vietnam. And if you remember, the C-141s out of Guam started coming into Saigon, and they loaded a lot of people out of Saigon and escaped. A lot of helicopters had come out of Saigon on the last days and landed on the Midway carrier, which was close off the coast of Vietnam. And Adderholt had worked his way with the government to get the Midway over to Utapao. So now he's got a flat deck sitting off of Utapao, and he had a plan. But out of South Vietnam, we got 165 aircraft back, U.S. military aircraft. There was 31 F-5s, and like I said, they were less than 100 hours, nearly brand new. There was 27 A-37s, and the main thing for Adderholt was there was 11 A-1s got out of there. There was 9 C-130s, 3 AC-119, 16 C-47s, 6 C-7s, 45 Huey helicopters. There's just a gob of stuff that got out of there. And Adderholt was interested in doing two things. He was going to save the F-5s and A-37s, and the North Vietnamese were not going to get those back. So he came up with a plan to get those loaded onto the Midway and get that ship back to the U.S., which is, I'll tell you about in a minute. The other thing was he knew that there was no way that he could get the A-1s out of Thailand except to maybe steal them. Well, back in the day, when he was working with the agency, he had constructed a large hangar at Tak Lee. Now, this hangar would fit a U-2 in it. And so he knew of that hangar. And so he got on the phone and talked to the powers that be. And he said, I need to use that hangar. If you can empty it, he said, I may have some aircraft coming up there to kind of hide, is the way he put it. And until we can do something else in the future. Well, he knew he had no right to steal those airplanes, F-5s and A-37s. But and right then, the State Department and the embassy and the Thailand government, they were just in a fizzy because they didn't want the North Vietnamese coming to Thailand to start inventorying aircraft and et cetera. So Adderholt just cut to the chase, and he went to the commander-in-chief, the SINC of the RTAF, and he said, look, he said, you're our ally, and we've been here a long time fighting and helping you and all, and we're still going to protect you. But he said, I need you to do me a favor. He said, I'm going to give you 5 brand new F-5s. And he said, I want then your permission to take all the F-5s that remain and A-37s and put them on the Midway and get them back to the States. And he said, in one of his nice ways, he said, that SINC shook his head and he said, let me get this straight. You're going to give me 5 F-5s if I just look the other way and you take those other F-5s and A-37s and put them on the carrier and get them out to the U.S. And he said, that's right. He said, you got a deal. They shook hands across the desk. And that sink sent some F-5 pilots down to Utapao, and they were the proud owner of 5 brand new F-5s, less than 100 hours, in less than about 6 hours. So Adderholt had the permission to steal what he could steal, and he started loading F-5s on that carrier. And there's a photo somewhere of those F-5s and A-37s on the carrier, which is a great photo. If I had it handy, I'd show it to you, but I don't. So while all this was going on, he got in touch with Drummond and me, and he says, get down there. And he says, I want you to look at the A-1s and see what can be done. He said, they may be battle damaged, whatever. Maybe they can fly, maybe they can't. But he said, they flew in here. And he said, I have a plan. I said, okay. And, you know, I think back to this time, and I never had a second thought about saying no to Adderholt. In fact, when he called me on the phone, you know, he said, Youngblood, he said, you ever ride a bicycle? I said, yes, sir. He said, you think you can ride it again? I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, get your butt down to Utapao. I want you to fly some A-1s. He said, you're going to remember how to fly those A-1s. You flew them 3 years ago, and Jack Drummond flew them 5 years ago. And he said, I don't think you forgot how to crank and start, taxi, and fly that airplane. I said, you got that right, sir. So I got on in the AU-23, and I got Jack Drummond at Don Muang, and we headed to Utapao, and we landed. And we went over there where the A-1s were, and they had been just everywhere on the grass, whatever. But the base ops folks and some other U.S. personnel that Colonel Holsten, who was in charge of the SAC detachment there, they had pushed all the A-1s off into a ditch. Now, you got to remember that when they built Utapao, it's right on the sea, so it's flat. So in order to build up the runway and build up the taxiway, they had to come up with some dirt. And they dug some tremendous ditches beside the taxiway and beside the runway to pile up that dirt and pack it so it could carry that B-52, which was the heaviest airplane we had in Vietnam or in Thailand. So they had, just for room's sake, to get them out of the way, they had put all the A-1s together, which I'm thankful for. So we saw them, and it was late in the afternoon, and I talked to the chief master sergeant there, and I said, Sarge, I said, if you can get those airplanes up, the A-1s up here on the grass, we'd like to look at them tomorrow. And he said, yeah, I think I can. Well, when we got there, and before he could get them out of there, the night before, it had rained during the monsoon in Thailand. And the ditch was about 2 foot deep of water. Well, the water had covered the tires, covered the wheels of the A-1. So all we saw was the top of the tire and the strut. And Jack and I looked at each other and said, you know, these brakes probably won't work. And this, I don't know what's going to happen. So anyway, they drug them out of the water. And the next morning we got out there and we started getting them out. And in this row of A-1s, the first one there was 332. And the second one was 683, which is an E model. So Jack and I got to looking around, and we said, you know, I think I remember how to crank this thing. And we got up on the wing of the E model, and we were going to take it and taxi out and fly around the pattern a while and just learn about the A-1 again. But as we looked into the A-1, there was no stick in the right seat. And the right seat didn't have a chute. And I said, Jack, I said, I'm not riding in the right seat. And he said, well, I'm not riding in the right seat. So that theory went out the door. And so we decided we're just going to crank them up and do the best we can. Well, we needed to sign out. We needed sign out authority. So we went to base ops and we said, we want to taxi these airplanes around. We didn't really tell them that we were going to repossess them. We said, we're going to taxi them around, check the engines out and see what they got and all, and maybe we'll fly them around the pattern. They said, well, we need some authority from somebody that says you can do that. And I said, okay. I just called Adderholt, and within an hour there was a sign out sheet in base ops, and the guy called me back and says, I don't know who you know, but he said, here's your sign out sheet. And he says, Jack Drummond and I signed out. And he said, oh, by the way, he says, this sign out sheet gives you authority to fly anything on this base. I said, well, we're not interested in anything else. I said, we're going to work with those A-1s. So we went back over to the A-1s, and at that time they had got them out, like I said, and we were up on the wing, and I just reached in, and I knew it had been raining big time, and the canopies had all been left open by the DNAV pilot. They just, you know, opened the canopy, got out, and left it where it was. So it rained heavy. So I pushed my hand down in the seat just to check it, and the water came up between the fingers and all. And I said, "Oh, Jack, I said, these parachutes in this seat are soaking wet." And they were silk. Well, silk doesn't open too easy and fly too well when it's soaking wet. So Jack and I said, we're going to leave the seat pin in. And in that Yankee extraction system, the ejection pin is right between your legs there. It's stuck in the seat. And you put it in and that seat won't fire. So we flew those airplanes out of Utapao all the way to Takli with the seat safety pin and the canopies back, because we didn't know what was going to happen if we closed the canopy and
shoot,
something happened and we had to land on a road or something, or that thing, we bailed it into a rice paddy and it flipped over on its back and the canopies closed and we couldn't get out. We weren't having that. So seat pin was in, the canopy was back. And the other thing we didn't really know was we didn't have any bombs or rockets under the wings or anything, but we didn't know if the guns had been safetied, and there was no safety pins in the guns. And usually there's a red streamer excuse me, off of every pin. So we didn't see that. So we didn't know the guns were hot or cold. So we just said, let's keep our fingers off the trigger. You know, we don't need to have any instance there to shoot up Thailand. So all in all, we knew that we went over the start procedures that we could remember. And so we got in there and we found a radio. We got the battery on. And you have to remember, they'd just flown a couple of days before. So batteries were charged. We filled them up with 115, 145 and filled up the oil and all this. And that's the best we could do. So in our walk-arounds, they were up on the grass. We did see a couple of bullet holes in the sides of the airplanes or whatever, but it wasn't something that would red tag the airplane where we couldn't fly it. At least we didn't think so. So we decided to take it anyway. They spray painted out the insignias of the VNAV Air Force on the side of the airplanes and wings. So no one could see that VNAV was flying around in Thailand. So it was officially a U.S. Air Force airplane, which is another story a little later. So we got in there and we talked on the radio just a little bit, and we had set the prop lever and the mixture lever and the throttle and all. And we knew from the days of old that you counted 16 blades across the nose of the airplane, and then you turned the mag onto both. There was two spark plugs in 18 cylinders in each cylinder. And so A was one and B was the other, and A, B was both of them. And I'd like to take just a second to show you a model that my roommate in Vietnam, or NKP, gave me, Cliff Groves. He sent me this beautiful A-1 model, mahogany wood, all designed up. This is a beauty, and I've loved it so much, and I want to thank you, Cliff, for this, you and Gabriel, for this model that you sent me. It's a beauty, and I love it, and I'll treasure it forever, and it sits on my desk. So thank you again. But as you can see, ladies, this was a big airplane with a single seat. And I've always flown single seat. My whole career was single seat, A1s, A7s, A10s. And I've loved that. And that's part of my crazy Air Force career. But anyway, I got in the E model, and Drummond got in the 332, and we started cranking them up, and we got them fired up. And they were running, sitting there. And I told Jack, I said, Jack, keep the needles in the green and we'll be all right, buddy. I think we're going to have it set there. So we had opened the cowling a little bit, and temperature was right, and fuel pressure or oil pressure was up. And so we called for taxi, and we decided that it was significant that we go with a good call sign. So we signed out as Sandy 1 and Sandy 2. And we thought that was pretty neat. So we got up on the taxiway, and we got permission to taxi from the tower, and we taxied out. And just so happened with those call signs, as we taxied north to take off over the water down south, there was two Jolly Greens, HA-53s, parked there with the rotors running. I don't know the mission, whether they were there to rescue people or not or whatever, but we saluted them as we taxied by, and they saluted us. And it was just like the old days at NKP when we were running SAR missions. So that made me feel pretty good. So we got up there to the end, and we had been working and checking the brakes and all, and they seemed like they would hold okay. And we didn't really want to run them up like we would to ops check the engine. We just said we're going to roll down the runway, and we'll put the power up to, we didn't need a full power because that engine was so big. Once you got off the ground, it would try to torque roll the airplane around the engine. So that was 12,000 foot, and we only needed to get airborne. So at 110, 15 knots, we would get in the air and we wouldn't have to work the brakes too much. And the H model had a smaller rudder than the E model, so it was easier for me to keep it on the center line. But Jack had no problem. He took off and went down, and he got airborne, and he left the gear down until he had turned out of traffic and headed back north. And then he told me, he said, I'm going to raise the gear. And I took off, and I moved into like a route position, which is 3 or 4 aircraft widths away from him. And I'm a little bit above him, so I can look down through his airplane. My gear was up. Our canopies were open, like I said, but we were talking to each other on Fox mic, which is an FM radio. We also had a VHF radio that operated. So we we're flying along at 1,500 foot, and we were talking back and forth about how we were going to land, and hey, everything's okay, and remember this and remember that and everything. So that's another little funny point that I'll tell you about in a minute. But so we called into Dockley Tower, and we told them. They already knew. Adderholt had greased the skids, and so they knew we were coming. He cleared us, so we went down initial, Sandy 1 and 2. We pitched out and landed and taxied in, and the base commander met us, and we turned the keys over, so to speak, to the base commander. In that time, Adderholt had told one of the Army fixed-wing airplane, I think it's a U-21, similar to the Beech King Air, to go to Dockley and pick us up and take us back down to Utapao, which he did. And so we got on the airplane, and we were flying back, and the captain in there flying the airplane kind of leaned back, and he said, hey, he says, you two guys are unbelievable. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I was on your Fox mic with you all the way. And he said, I never heard of 2 pilots learning to fly the airplane again on the radio as you were flying the airplane. So we laughed about that a little bit. And I said, yeah, we had to figure things out before we tried to land that thing. So anyway, he took us back to Utapao. It was kind of late in the afternoon. Excuse me again. And the next day was the 4th. So the next day was the 5th. And we went back out to the airplanes. And the next 2 airplanes in the row was 665, which finally wound up with Neil and Rhonda Milton at the Tennessee Air Museum, and 606, which wound up at the Cavanaugh Air Museum in Addison, Texas, or around Dallas. But long story short, we got in, and man, we're old hands now, you know, so we didn't have a problem thinking about what we're going to do. But about the time we got ready that morning to crank up and move out, this staff car comes rolling down the taxiway and stops, and the door comes open, and this colonel comes walking over to us, and hey, he says, I need to talk to you guys. He says, I got a call from, I don't know who it was, PACAF or somebody, and they want to know, they understand you flew those A1. They want to know when you got current to fly those A1s. When did you go back and get some training or get current? Jack and I looked at each other, and we looked at him. We said, yesterday. And he just shook his head, and he said, get out of here. So he got back in his car, and he knew we were going to steal him. So we cranked him up and taxied him out, and it was great. And at that time, we didn't know that we couldn't come back and get the rest, but the word was getting out that the F-5s and A-37s were gone. They were on the Midway, and there wasn't anything to do that PACAF or the State Department rather could do to stop that. It was done, but they could stop us from stealing the A1s. But we got those 2 airborne, and we headed to Tackley. So again, we were down initial, pitched out, and as Jack Drummond touched down, I saw that he was rolling out. Hey, Jack, you down? And he said, yeah, I'm down. I said, well, I guess that makes me the last A1 pilot to fly the A1s. And that was an official U.S. Air Force flight of A1s on the 4th and 5th and 6th of May, 1975. So the A1s had a long, long history. So when we got back into, and there's a photo of us turning over 332 on the 5th of May to the base commander there in Tackley. And I looked a lot better there than I do now, but that's not the story. Anyway, I was happy to fly with Jack. Jack was just a superb pilot. He had flown with Adderholt earlier when T-28s were flying out of NKP and bombing the trail at night. I mean, you gotta have a big pair to go on the trail at night and bomb in the dark and T-28s and all. But he did it, and then he transitioned to A-1s and did some testing down at Eglin Air Force Base in A-1. So he's qualified to fly the A-1 with me, and we remained good friends for a long time. And anyway, once we got back into Utapao after taking the 665 and 3 and 606 down, we got a call from base ops, said, you got a phone call. So Adderholt was online. He said, he said, we did some good work. He said, I got all the F5s out, all the A37s out. And he said, I sent a maintenance team down there. And he said, I have cut the guns out of every AC-119 and anything that had a weapon in it. He got cutting torches, and they cut the guns out and threw them in the back of the old Air Force bread truck. And he said, if the North Vietnamese want those Hulks, they can come and get them. And they were worthless. And I mean, anything that could fly. He did a lot of other stuff that I won't talk about, to the engines of the helicopters and everything. And he said, we can rebuild those airplanes if they're turned over to the Thais. But he said, if the North Vietnamese want them, they're going to have to send trucks to get them because they're not going to fly them out of here. So anyway, he was just that hardcore, and I was with him all the way. And he said the State Department had called him directly and said, stop the movement of the A-1s. So we were told to return to duty, as he put it. And but we had done some good work as I look back on it now. And I just have to think that today, if you were an F-15 pilot and you walked out on the ramp and you said, I flew this airplane a couple of years ago, and I think I'll get in it and see if I can start it and go fly. First of all, you'd probably be shot before you could get in. And second, you'd be court-martialed, and it just didn't happen. But under General Adderholt, he was the law. And like I said, it's a Wild West show. And he was writing the law down there, and he was doing what he wanted to do. He was the only general in Thailand, and he was running the show. And SAC was glad to get the airplanes out of there. And their big problem was handling all the refugees, which was a problem. But you have to understand, these people had left their home, and some of them refused to be evacuated to Guam. They just didn't want to go. Some said, no, I want to go back to Vietnam and get my family. And it was a struggle, but for Colonel Holsten and the forces that be there in Utapao to convince these people there is no South Vietnam anymore. The bad guys have overrun the embassy. They've taken over everything that was, and you'd be shot and killed if you went back or tried to go back. So little by little, the acceptance of a new life. And you have to remember that 97-year-old grandmother with a goldfish, and that 17-year-old girl with a 4-day-old Bible, our baby, now headed to freedom. And it was a time that really made me value my freedom and the things that America stands for, and all the effort that went into us trying to save South Vietnam, and all the lives that were lost. And if you go back to the wall and you look at all those names, and you know that they died serving their country and doing what they thought was right. And I'm lucky to be here. And again, Bob, I thank you for everything. I want to thank a couple of people. I found out that 606 went back to Kavanaugh Museum. Now, let me just tell you the story first. Adderholt went back to the A-1s. There's a photo of him standing next to the A-1s at Talkley. And he wound up getting those things on a truck and down to the river. And he loaded them on rice barges. So you want to know how they got back to the States. This is pretty much the way it was. There's General Adderholt standing next to the A-1s. And he's just about ready to put them on trucks to go to the river to be floated down to Bangkok. Well, give and take, he got them on each one on a rice barge. I don't know how much he paid to do that, but the water wasn't deep enough in some places, so he had to pay 20,000 baht to a guy that was in charge of a dam on the river to flood the river in some way or some section of it, so the boats could be could float and go down, and they did. And they worked their way little by little down to Bangkok. So he got them down there. Now here's a significant thing that Airhope pulled off. You have to understand, we were in the war with the North Vietnamese. They were using SA-7s and SAMs and all that had been provided by Russia or whatever. And here we are with 4 A-1s in the harbor of Bangkok. And Airhope negotiates with a Russian trawler, a Russian boat, to carry the 4 A-1s to California. So it's just some very ironic things that happened, but that just goes to the fact that Airhope was just a wheeler and a dealer. I've often said he was the art of the deal before the art of the deal with President Trump. So I'm just telling you, he pulled off stuff that you wouldn't believe. And it hadn't been for him there, none of this would have happened. I guarantee the A-1s would have not got out if there would have been a different commander of MACV at the time. But he was who he was. And I was proud to know him and work for him and proud of him this day. But back to the 606 back at Kavanaugh, I want to thank Ken Smith. Ken Smith is a pilot that worked for Delta. He was a captain. He got interested in the A-1s. He went to our reunions. I got to meet him and all. And we found out that 606 wound up at Kavanaugh Air Museum in Addison, Texas. And being with Delta, he worked away for Delta's paint shop to repaint 606 just back the way it was in the Vietnam days. And he was so meticulous in the design that he had every stencil, every nomenclature, every marking, everything on that airplane was perfect. So hats off to Ken Holsten, who flew 606. And he flew it in one of its last flights when it was flying with 665 and 683 out in Colorado at a reunion where those three airplanes got back together again. So thank you, Ken, for all you did. And I want to thank Ken Smith, my crew chief back at NKP. That staff sergeant was an unbelievable man. 6 days on, sometimes a day off, 12-hour shifts. And he was a crew chief of my aircraft, A-1, every time I went out to get in it. And I would walk around that airplane, and I couldn't really check things out a lot, but I looked in the book, and some things had been signed off, and it was flyable. And I just closed the book. I looked at Ken. I said, "Will it fly?" And he said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Let's go." So that's the way that happened. And I he checked my Yankee seat connections and straps every time I got in, and standing on the wing and patted me on the back and said, "Go get them." And so that was the way it was. But I owe a lot to Ken Smith. He lives in Bulverde, Texas now, and he's a deacon in the Church of Christ, which is a great situation, and we communicate and talk a lot. But he was also the dead commander at Da Nang. It was the NCOIC. When the A-1s would go there and sit SAR alert, he was in charge of those guys over there. So he is a great person, and he actually got out of the military, went back to school, got his commission, and got back into the POW MIA business and worked on that, returning some remains to the States. So wow. He's a tremendous individual. That's Ken Smith. I want to thank Dr. Paul Carter, who is working with me also on some documentaries of the Vietnam era. He's a tremendous person. He does documentaries. We did some work just recently about the fall of Vietnam. And if you get to read and see or listen to any of his documentaries, they are class act. So thank you, Dr. Paul, for all you're doing. And I might say Dr. Paul went with myself and three other A-1 pilots. Last year we went to, or not too long ago, we went into Laos to go back to the old Ho Chi Minh Trail and see some of the sites where we had been fighting. So it was unusual to walk on the ground where we had been bombing and shooting, and we had been in the air, but we now saw some of the places on the ground, and that Dr. Paul went with us, and that was a great trip. Also want to thank Neil and Rhonda Melton. They're in charge of the Tennessee Air Museum at Sevierville, and if you have a chance to go there and visit their museum, 665 is in there, and it was a great airplane. He keeps it running today, and I just want to thank him very much for the expense that they've been out to keep 665 in the air. And and he flies it, and I appreciate that. And I want to also thank some of my best buds, Cliff Groves, obviously, who was my roommate at NKP, John Goldenbaum, John Ralston. Those three guys went with me back into Laos last year to visit those sites and all. And I want to thank one other person, and that's Rich Benjamin. He's a guy that has gotten acquainted with the A-1 Association. He's done a lot of interviews. Rich is a tremendous person to document the histories of pilots, and his counterpart or his running mate, Ray, who helps him out a lot. And I just hats off to all those people that are bringing back a lot of things. As I told you, the A-1 book by Adderholt, his history is something you need to read. This is another book that I have that was given to me by Judy Gervais. There's a lot of beautiful photos that she put inside of my history in A1, but it's the A1 SKYRAIDER. I think it's by Wayne Mutza. And if you can get this book and if you can look at it, it's just tremendous. It is the total history of what went on. But through these documentaries like Bob is doing and like Dr. Paul is doing and some other people have done, Texas Tech has a whole department that's doing Vietnam or war histories. The stories finally come out. The good part is that you're getting to hear some of the details about the oldest person and maybe the youngest person to get out of Vietnam to freedom. You're hearing about the troubles and the thoughts that Jack Grumman and I had about flying the airplane and would it fly, and never doubted the fact that we were told to do it by General Adderholt. So I love my time, 24 years in the Air Force. I wouldn't change a thing. General Adderholt got me an assignment out of JustMag into A7s at Davis Monthan. I spent a great career in A7s and got to help them with their SAR manual, how to write some things we learned in the A1 into the SAR manual. I moved on to Myrtle Beach flying A7s, and as Myrtle Beach became the first base in 75 or 76 to bring on the A-10, the 353rd was the last squadron of A7s, and we transitioned to the A-10s. And so I transitioned to another single-seat airplane. Wound up going out to Nellis in the 422nd and flying some tests and evaluation. There I am in the A7 at Myrtle. And I enjoyed the 422nd at Nellis, testing the A-10. And so I had a good first 18 years. And finally got a phone call from MPC saying, "You've had it. You've been in the cockpit all your life. You're going to go have to fly a desk or do something different." And he says, "We got a couple assignments here." So they offered me the ops officer job at the 604th Direct Air Support Squadron in Red Flag, Korea. So I said, well, I got 2 years to go. I said, all right, I'll go there and do that. So I was there. In about 18 months, this is funny. This is why I talked about the why in the road and so many things that's happened to me that were so unusual. About 19 years and 10 months into my time, I got a phone call from MPC, and I got that old favorite saying, "Youngblood, you're the only man in the computer that can do this job." And I just shook my head. I said, yeah. I said, what is it? He said, well, we had a guy in language training that didn't make it. He said, I got a short fill assignment back to JustMag, and you are the only pilot with a fighter pilot AFSC that's graduated from DLI that's still active in the Air Force. He said, I need you to go back to Thailand for 1 year and fill that while I'd send somebody to pilot to DLI in language training. And I said, 1 year. I said, well, what's the other option? He said, well, he said, if you want, he said, you can stay 4 years and you can retire at 24 years instead of 20 or 21. And I said, well, throw me into that briar patch. I said, I'll do that. I said, when do I need to be back into Thailand? He said, in about 4 months. So I said, well, send me back to DLI for a short course with somebody to refresh my memory on Thai language, and then I'll head out to JustMag. And he said, you got it. So I had an assignment out of Korea back to DLI for 3 months and then back to JustMag, where I spent the last 4 years of my career flying the C-12 King Air all over. And I worked with Colonel Ralph Wetterhahn, who was the commander of the Air Force Division there. we got to know each other and swapping tales and telling lies. And so he learned about what all happened at Utapau, and that's why I think he wound up writing that book, or writing the article for the Smithsonian. And it's a great article, and he did a lot of good research in that and telling the details. But I certainly enjoyed working with him and working with all these people that make these documentaries. And again, Bob, I thank you. And if you have any Q&A here, I'll be glad to talk or not, or if not, I'll sign off.
I think since we're at a good point here with you covering your career, and we're going to have you back again. We've already gone coming up on an hour and a half now. So I think we'll cut it off right now, and I think we'll try and plan for part 2. Maybe you can start with a few stories, and then we can just jump into Q&A for the second time you come on and join us. We can just get question and answers out of the way.
No problem. So, I appreciate it. I thank you for the effort you put into pulling this off and putting me on and all. And I'll be glad to get back with you anytime, brother.
It means the world to us. And now that I've got that we're connected on email and my phone.
I would like to say one last thing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I moved back to Thailand after I was by the VA. I was rated at 100% disabled for various reasons. But I needed to move from Texas, where I lived on a large piece of land and a house all by myself. And I thought, well, I said, I know I can live in Thailand, and it's convenient, it's nice, and I love the people and all. So I decided to pack up and move back. And I'm back here now. I'm in Chiang Rai, in the most northeast part of Thailand. And as luck would have it, and the why in the road always happens for me, I met a man in Just Mag one Friday as I went back down there to meet up with some of those folks. And he was telling me about NKP and Air Chief Marshal Vorachat and his dream of renovating NKP to somewhat like it was before, not totally, but they were going to build up the air base. And but I talked to him and I said, yes. So I actually flew up to NKP, first time I'd been back there in a long time. I met him and we were talking, and he said, I want to build a museum up here that honors all of the U.S. Air Force personnel from 65 to 75. He said, every unit that was on this base, I want them to have a place in this museum where they can tell their story. And people that come back and bring their children or grandchildren or whatever to see where Dad was flying in the war, I want this museum to be here, along with some other things he's building. So I'm now involved with Air Chief Marshal Vorachat in rebuilding NKP. And some of the A-1 guys know about this, and there'll be some stories to tell and some photos that I'm sure people have laying around that they'd like to dedicate to the museum. And we'll get into that in time with the A-1 Association. And so I just am happy that I'm still working at NKP. I feel like I've come full circle. I'm back where I started, and I'm healthy, so to speak.
That's just amazing. And we're gonna have a lot of fun when you return for part 2, and we get into some Q&A because I know we're gonna have some great questions after you're going through your career. So thank you for waking up early to sit down with us for an hour and a half. We appreciated it, and I'll be in touch with you, and we'll start lining up part 2 here for sometime in November.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. God bless.
God bless you.